Fellowship of the Broken, Making Sense of 12-Step Recovery by Angelo. Chapter 50. Mind the Gap. Addiction can be a baffling condition to overcome. The root of the problem is the personal ego self, yet this personal identity is so habitual and ingrained that it takes time and practice before it begins to loosen its grip. This process takes quite some time for most of us. It will certainly take several months, and in many cases it will take several years. For others it may take even longer. Some addicts remain abstinent and struggle with recovery for decades without ever fully grasping what recovery is all about. Such is the power of being attached to the personal ego self. This attachment to our personal thoughts and feelings creates many traps and obstacles to recovery. Until the necessary self-realization occurs, the overall problem is that the personal ego mind makes most of the decisions, and yet it's the personal ego mind that is the core problem. We are using a selfish, self-centered mind to decide how and when we will go about trying to be less selfish and less self-centered. This catch-22 type problem can easily keep us trapped in personal suffering for a long time and can often lead us back to a relapse with devastating consequences. I've witnessed many recoveries and I've also seen many relapses. These relapses never have a good outcome for the addict or their loved ones. Sometimes a relapse results in death. This is the nature of addiction. Recovery is a serious business, and it's wise to be aware of the many pitfalls. It would be unrealistic to attempt to provide a definitive list of all of these pitfalls. Unique human beings have unique problems, but nevertheless there are similarities and common mistakes. Our deeper understanding of the problem of addiction and the solution should enable us to identify these common mistakes and comprehend why they occur. If we can be forewarned, then we can at least be forearmed. I can only share my experience. I've made most of the mistakes listed below, and have observed the remainder in others with whom I have worked closely. Effective and sustained recovery requires persistent, consistent effort until it becomes effortless. The purpose is to facilitate a transformation in identity from personal self to non-personal consciousness, from ego mind to universal mind, from human to being, from body and mind to spirit. All of the pitfalls fit into the category of traps and obstacles that prevent this persistent and consistent effort. All of them are the product of thoughts, opinions and beliefs of the personal ego mind. We are not only the entire problem, but we also create the barriers that prevent the simple solution from being effective. Little wonder that success rates are so low. We are literally sabotaging ourselves. The title of this chapter sums up the potential problem. Any gap in our commitment to recovery will create difficulties. These difficulties will range from dis-ease to despair to relapse to death. If we want effective recovery, then we need to mind the gap as if our lives depend upon it. The first barriers arise before recovery even starts. 12-step recovery is either unheard of or perceived to be unnecessary or not attractive. The mythical cult status may also be off-putting. Other treatment options may seem more desirable, and 12-step recovery may be seen as a last resort. We may believe that our addiction or mental health condition is different from others, and that 12-step recovery is not sufficient. We may feel that a solution that is free of charge cannot possibly be as good as those that we have to pay for. There may be shame or embarrassment at the idea of having to attend 12-step meetings. We may have a friend or family member who has tried 12-step recovery and not found it to their liking. The list of reasons for not even starting goes on, and all of them are based on misunderstanding. If we do finally attend a 12-step meeting, then we are immediately confronted with the God word. Most personal selves have preconceived ideas about what this word means. Some of these ideas are helpful, but many of them are not. The fact that all fellowships clearly state that it is God as we understood him is often not sufficient to overcome prejudice. There is suspicion that this is just a ruse to get us started, and that eventually we will have to concede to the Christian idea of God or some other collective concept. If we're not prepared to be open-minded from the outset, then the God word can be a big barrier to recovery. The personal self thus creates a self-imposed restriction on its own potential salvation. Another early pitfall is a lack of belief that a simple 12-step program can be an effective solution to the complex and soul-destroying handicap of addiction. Other fellowship members tell us sincerely that it does work, but the personal mind struggles to see how it possibly can. There is skepticism and a lack of trust. We place too much faith in our own minds and reject the well-meaning help and advice of others. Our own arrogant thinking continues to thwart us, despite the positive evidence of success in others that is readily available. Another problem is that the personal ego self considers itself to be special and different. There is a tendency to compare ourselves to others. If we feel that others are far worse than us, then the personal mind will conclude that 12-step recovery is not necessary, or that we don't need to put in as much effort as they do. If we think that we are worse than others, then we may feel that 12-step recovery is not a strong enough solution for our particular case. The personal self will always find ways to maintain its uniqueness and hence rule itself out of the solution. It will resist true fellowship in favour of illusory independence. Addicts have formed the habit of self-harm. The abuse of substances and behaviours arises from low self-esteem and a lack of self-worth. We're not used to taking care of ourselves. Even if we do seek recovery, these tendencies towards self-harm can prevent us from engaging in the very practices that will lead to the solution. We are now so familiar with not feeling good that the idea of a more positive outlook on life seems uncomfortable. We can actually feel safe in a state of depression, resentment and self-pity. We seem to suffer from a subconscious desire to sabotage our own well-being. All of this is a distorted function of the personal ego mind, and it prevents the qualities of consciousness from being expressed. We have to let this go. Each of us is worthy of recovery, whatever may have happened in the past. Human beings prefer not to look at their own shortcomings, and instead deny their own brokenness. We would rather judge, criticize and blame others than admit our own faults. Even if we admit we are addicts, there will still be a reluctance to turn the spotlight inwards and look at our shadow self. We may fear exposing deep-seated issues and prefer to let sleeping dogs lie. We maintain the mask of persona at the expense of self-honesty. The personal self protects its own image. We may see addiction as the problem rather than our own selves. We talk about addiction as if it's an illness that can be cured, whilst leaving the rest of the personal ego self intact. We hear what we want to hear and discard the real wisdom. We can fall victim to the mistake of cherry-picking those parts of the fellowship and the steps that seem acceptable to the personal self. We may attend meetings, read the literature and even undertake service, yet still avoid recovery. We create our own tailored version of recovery based on what we think is best and ignore the rest of it. We are allowing the personal ego mind to pass judgment on perennial wisdom, and then we try to fool ourselves into believing that our thinking is correct. Self-righteousness prevents us from surrendering to the specific process that has helped so many others. We shoot ourselves in the foot and then blame it on the gun. We may fail to appreciate the seriousness of our condition. We hear that addiction is progressive, but we don't believe that it can possibly get worse for us. We consider that worsening consequences are highly unlikely in our case. We ignore the wealth of evidence to the contrary and convince ourselves that our case is different. Our personal minds filter out anything that does not fit within our preconceived ideas. We are blinded by our own self-serving opinions. The personal mind always likes to think that it knows best. We are full of opinions and beliefs, but we lack wisdom. Most human beings do not like to feel uncomfortable, and addicts in particular are past masters at avoiding dis-ease. This is why we used substances and behaviours in the first place. Change can be uncomfortable, and hence the idea of change is not appealing. But change cannot happen within our comfort zone. We make the mistake of trying to ease our way through recovery by largely avoiding discomfort. The caterpillar tries to find an easy way through metamorphosis and hence never actually surrenders to the process. We can waste a lot of time pretending to be in recovery without actually making any progress at all. Discomfort is part of the process. This is one reason why fellowship is so important. We provide each other with support and encouragement. It's okay to feel uncomfortable, and it's also necessary. We may confuse recovery with abstinence. This is an easy and understandable mistake to make, but nevertheless it is a big mistake. Abstinence is obviously necessary and desirable, but it's not the be-all and end-all. We may collect our sobriety coins and receive the applause of our fellows, yet remain firmly stuck in early recovery, and this can sometimes go on for years. The personal self is resisting the opportunity for transformation. We fall victim to the acronym JEST, which stands for Just Enough Sobriety to achieve our particular personal objectives. We trick ourselves into believing that abstinence is the cure to addiction, and that the longer we go, the safer we will be. The truth is that we will remain vulnerable to relapse until the spiritual solution is in place. Self-sabotage lurks unseen and can surface through all manner of triggering events. After a period of abstinence, we may begin to forget how bad it really was when we first came into recovery. We may experience euphoric recall and dwell upon the seemingly good and happy times, and conveniently overlook all of the misery and harm. The idea may come that perhaps we could resume using previous substances and behaviours, and this time keep it all under control. We may conclude that we are exceptions to the rule of inevitable progression. All the while that we remain identified as the personal ego self, we have the capacity to think ourselves into a disastrous relapse. We are then puzzled as to why this has happened. We have failed to understand the true nature of the problem and the necessity for the solution. Sometimes this cycle is repeated many times, and it always gets worse. We may be confused about the idea of lifestyle balance. Recovery can be seen as a part-time activity to be fitted in with other aspects of life. We may limit our commitment to recovery due to other priorities. We're told that anything that we place ahead of our recovery will eventually be lost through relapse. We hear the advice, but we don't believe it. We insist that we are entitled to set our own priorities. We fail to understand that all of these other priorities are pulling us back into identity as the personal ego self, and actually undermining any progress that's being made through 12-step recovery. We are taking one step forward and 2 steps backwards. We obviously need to attend to our particular responsibilities, but recovery needs to be the number one priority until the transformation is well underway. We need an intense period of focus on recovery. The caterpillar does not eat leaves and wander around while it is in the cocoon. There will be plenty of time and opportunity to engage fully in life once the spiritual awakening has begun and the tools are being used. It's a big mistake to try to achieve balance too quickly. This is yet another way in which the personal ego self tries to stay in control of the process. If we manage to overcome all of the obstacles so far, then it will become obvious that we need to get ourselves a sponsor. Addicts generally do not like being told what to do. The idea of having to follow suggestions is not appealing. We may have a clear idea of what sort of sponsor we prefer. We may choose someone who we like and with whom we feel comfortable. The personal self is thus dictating the terms of its own recovery. We may delay getting a sponsor indefinitely because we've not yet met anyone who fits our preconceived requirements. We may make a start and then part company because we don't like what's being suggested. We want recovery on our own terms. We lack humility. We're reluctant to commit. We fail to understand that the personal ego self that's making these decisions is the source of the problem. We can misunderstand the meaning of the word suggestions. The 12-step program works and is a suggested means of recovery. If we want recovery, then we need to follow the whole process and use all of the tools. The individual components of the program are not suggestions. It's a mistake to assume that certain elements of the process are not necessary. If we view them as suggestions, then we are likely to avoid the ones that seem unpalatable. We thereby avoid recovery. 12-step recovery is obviously optional, but if we want recovery, then the whole program is compulsory. It is a potentially fatal mistake to be fooled by the idea of suggestions. Working with a sponsor can be a struggle if we insist on remaining closed-minded. We all have preconceived ideas and beliefs, but we need to let these go. If we have a misplaced faith in our own personal intelligence, then we can create big problems for ourselves. We can end up with paralysis through analysis. We can get stuck at any stage by insisting that we have to fully understand and believe in the process before progressing. Understanding comes through wisdom, and wisdom has nothing to do with personal intelligence. Wisdom is revealed by consciousness later as the transformation proceeds. If we want recovery, then we have to trust the process. Those already in recovery are telling the truth. and there's no reason not to trust them. Yet, the personal ego mind trusts only itself. There's no recovery without surrender. We may remain convinced that addiction is a specific problem rather than a feature of the holistic human condition. If addiction is perceived to be a faulty part of an otherwise perfect ego mind, then we are in for a long struggle. We may blame all of our shortcomings on addiction rather than seeing addiction as a manifestation of our human nature. Addiction is not an isolated aspect of the personal self. Addiction is a malfunctioning of the entire personal ego, based on over-identification as only a personal self. 12-step recovery is a holistic solution to a holistic problem. If we focus only on sobriety, then we will continue to suffer the consequences from living life only on the basis of being a person. This is often clearly so obvious from our continuing struggles, yet somehow we manage to miss the fundamental point of recovery. Steps 4 and 5 can be a big stumbling block in recovery. It's not unusual to get stuck at this stage, and sometimes it can result in relapse. We fear looking at our shadow selves, and we fear exposing ourselves to someone else. This self-centered fear is an aspect of the personal self, and it keeps us trapped in the personal self. Despite praying to be relieved of the bondage of self in step 3, we don't really understand what this means. We know that we need to move forwards, but we come up with all manner of excuses to delay. The personal self is protecting itself, and self-centered fear is the primary shield. We come into recovery initially because the fear of relapse outweighs the fear of engaging in 12-step fellowship. If we wait too long and experience a period of sobriety, then the fear of relapse recedes, and the fear of looking at ourselves regains the upper hand. Well, what happens next is inevitable. Either we will relapse, or we will suffer the consequences of holding on to the personal self in sobriety. If this is understood, we will push through the fear of steps 4 and 5. We may find the process of recovery emotionally challenging and uncomfortable. We've spent our lives suppressing and avoiding intense emotions, and we have medicated these feelings with substances and behaviours. We are now having to go through a potential roller coaster of emotions without our usual coping mechanisms. We assume that we are struggling more than others. We may feel that the process is not working. If we are not cocooned sufficiently in fellowship, then these feelings may lead us to a relapse. If it all gets too uncomfortable, then we may even decide that sobriety is not worth the effort, and hence deliberately relapse in order to stop the process. Until the personal self loses its grip, we remain vulnerable to a moment of insane self-sabotage. We need to be honest about these doubts and fears, and share our thoughts and feelings with our sponsor and fellows. We may be unique individuals, but there are many who have travelled this path before us and have experienced similar issues. We fear judgment, but there will be none. The personal self will be tempted to hide these feelings and pretend that all is well. It's far better to be honest. This is one of the reasons why honesty is so important in recovery. Once we have finally worked through the 12 steps and gained a period of sobriety, then we are faced with a new set of obstacles that need to be navigated. The first of these is the belief that we are now cured and can resume our lives without any further involvement in 12-step recovery. The crisis is over and fellowship is no longer required. Not only is this selfish, ungrateful and inconsiderate, but it completely misses the whole point of recovery. We've been taken to the edge of our existence, been freely offered the golden opportunity of transformation, and have turned our back on the invitation. We've returned to living as a caterpillar and selfishly acted against the will of life itself. There can only be one outcome. Sooner or later, consciousness will issue another invitation, and this time it will be more forceful. We all have free will, but free will of this kind will come at a very heavy price. If we do engage effectively in recovery, then life will very likely become busy again. Relationships will be repaired and renewed. Careers may take off. New opportunities will arise, and we will be keen to make up for lost time. All of this activity will place pressure on our priorities. The longer we are in recovery, the more these pressures are likely to build. It will be tempting to push recovery down the priority list. Other previously mentioned factors will also be influential, and gradually we drift away from 12-step fellowship, and gradually we phase out our daily practices. Slowly but surely the personal ego self regains control. We start moving backwards on the spectrum of balance between human and being. If we don't keep spinning the plate of recovery, then eventually it will wobble and crash to the ground, and the length of sobriety previously enjoyed will be irrelevant. We will be back in the hell of addiction. The next trap is similar but relates specifically to overconfidence and complacency. We know that we're not cured, but there's a feeling that we no longer need to put in so much effort. We give ourselves permission to ease off, safe in the knowledge that we can always ramp it back up again if things get tricky. There is an assumption that we can control the wild horse of personal ego and live dangerously. We still think that life is all about the personal self. But this attitude always leads to suffering, with or without a relapse. We are making the same mistake as previously, but this time the motives are more subtle. The further we go in recovery, the more subtle the machinations of the personal ego become. We may become bored with 12-step fellowship. Going to the same meetings every week and hearing the same old shares can become tiresome. We've heard it all before and are no longer learning anything new. We can become irritable and judgmental. All we hear are people moaning about their personal lives. Either that or evangelical sharing, which tends to create rejection rather than attraction. We can come away from meetings feeling worse than before we went. Our initial enthusiasm is long forgotten, and it all becomes a bit stale. Now we are vulnerable to the familiar thought that we don't really need to bother anymore with recovery. All of this is in the realm of the personal ego mind. We're supposed to be participating in fellowship in order to help others. We're supposed to be selfless rather than selfish and self-centered. If we are bored, then we're being selfish and going backwards. 12-step fellowships are comprised of all sorts of people and personalities at different stages of recovery. There may be many that we like, but some that we do not. We may get involved in service at group or intergroup level and get tangled up in the politics of ego. There may be people who disrupt meetings or others that share in ways that we consider inappropriate. The general tone may be one of unconditional love, but we can still find ourselves getting irritated or resentful. We might even clash with others and find ourselves reluctant to attend a particular meeting for fear of conflict. 12-step fellowship can be a battleground for personal egos just as much as life outside. And all of this is a reflection on our attachment to the personal ego self. We learned in step 4 to take our own inventory rather than focusing on the behaviour of others. All interactions are an opportunity for self-awareness and the further practice of step 10. It would be a mistake to allow challenging personal relationships to push us away from fellowship. Our purpose is to let go of taking things personally and focus instead on being of service to others. Any fellowship of men and women is bound to produce romantic relationships. Mutual vulnerability can be powerfully attractive. The issue here is not one of taboo, but of practicalities. Personal relationships are, by definition, personal. Our purpose in recovery is to move away from the personal self. Intimate relationships can be a trigger for the whole range of negative human attributes, and hence restrict recovery. If we are single, then it's suggested that we remain so until we are fully established in recovery. If we are married or already in a relationship, then again the suggestion is to maintain the status quo until we are in a position to be guided by consciousness rather than the ego mind. These suggestions make sense in the context of the overall objective of recovery. We are, of course, at liberty to ignore these suggestions, but it would be wise at least to understand our motives. Romantic relationships can be another subtle trap that frustrates recovery. In some cases, it can lead to relapse. The spiritual toolkit is comprehensive and necessary. We're bound to individually favour some practices over others. It will be tempting to practice those tools that we like and enjoy, and to avoid those that we do not. Well, this is the personal self trying to muscle in on spiritual practice. This is a very subtle form of self-sabotage that perpetuates the personal self-identity. We will tend to dislike the tools that feel personally uncomfortable. We need the courage and wisdom from the Serenity Prayer to see this trap. It is the tools that we personally dislike that offer us the most potential for change. The very fact that we don't like them is the best reason possible for practicing them. We are acting against the preferences of the personal self, and thereby working to shift the balance of identity. We can fool ourselves that we're doing well in recovery by practicing with only part of the toolkit. It's far more worthwhile to practice the tools that we resist, because wisdom arises from non-personal universal mind rather than personal preferences. If we come into recovery having already been strongly indoctrinated into a particular faith, then we may find difficulty in reconciling these pre-existing beliefs with the principles of 12-step recovery. We've explored how all faiths and spiritual traditions are actually underpinned by the same perennial wisdom, but this is not always obvious to those who believe that their faith is exclusively correct. And there can also be an immature understanding of what any particular faith truly means. We may have faith, but this is of little use if the identity of the personal self remains unchallenged. If parts of the spiritual toolkit do not fit into our current faith-based understanding or practice, it may seem to make sense to ignore them. We need to remain open-minded. There's tremendous wisdom in 12-step fellowship. The great thing about the 12-step program is that it is a process intended to bring about individual transformation and revelation. Whatever our conditioned faith may have been, it has previously been insufficient to overcome addiction. 12-step fellowship will allow access to wisdom that reveals and heals the core problem, and it can also provide a deeper understanding of any pre-existing faith. We may find it relatively easy to follow spiritual principles within 12-step fellowship but might still be tempted to think and behave selfishly or dishonestly in other areas of our lives. This is another example of where we can make progress in recovery on the one hand, and then undo all of the good work by continuing with behaviours that pull in the opposite direction. Selfishness and dishonesty are aspects of the personal ego self. It will often be tempting to act selfishly, but this is more destructive than we may realise. If we want good recovery, then we need to be practicing these principles in all of our affairs, and there are no exceptions. Even small acts of selfishness are counterproductive. We need to remain self-aware and watch out for the many subtle ways in which the personal self continues to hold on. It is difficult enough for us to understand 12-step recovery, let alone our family and friends. It may be that they do not support our involvement. They may even feel that our loyalties have been diverted elsewhere and that we now give them insufficient attention. They may complain or make it difficult for us to give priority to recovery. They can be so familiar with our old personal selves that they don't like how we are changing as we recover. We may find family and friends pulling us away from 12-step recovery at the very time that we need it. We cannot expect them to understand, but we do need their encouragement and support. If this is not forthcoming, then we will need the support of the fellowship even more. It's sometimes difficult to trust strangers above our own family and friends, but in truth we have little choice. Our loved ones will reap the benefits once we become established in recovery. We can become proud of our period of sobriety, proud of our recovery, proud of our own story, proud of the service that we do, proud of our ability to help others, proud of our track record as a sponsor, proud of our achievements outside of fellowship, proud of our spiritual qualities and wisdom, and basically proud of anything that the personal self can find to take pride in. We can even be proud of being humble. This pride is so very subtle, yet pride is the biggest hurdle to overcome. We're seeking freedom from the bondage of personal self, and pride is obviously personal. Consciousness has nothing to be proud of. It just is itself, and it is non-personal. Honest self-awareness is again the answer to this trap. Pride will sneak in from all directions, but we have the power to see it and discard it. The final trap in this list may perhaps seem to be a bit of a surprise. When we attend 12-step meetings, it's traditional to identify ourselves as addicts. Typically, we state our name and our addictions. This identification as an addict is repetitive and powerful. We are restating our personal identity time and time again at each meeting that we attend. The purpose of recovery is to let go of the personal self, yet we habitually remain attached to it. The personal self is the addict. Our true identity as consciousness is not an addict. And recovery is all about this change in identity. The personal self is powerless. Consciousness is powerful. We need to submit to a process that brings about a transformation in this identity. Anything that we do to undermine this process is not helpful. Well, it's not for me to suggest a change in tradition, but we do need to be mindful of how we identify ourselves. We are far more than we think we are. Personal identity is just a thought, and it's our belief in this thought that convinces us that we are only a personal ego self. This common belief is a misunderstanding, and it is the ultimate block to the transformational freedom that we are all seeking. Well, this list of 30 potential pitfalls in recovery is fairly comprehensive, but highly unlikely to be complete. The personal ego mind ranges from gross to subtle, and hence there must be many more ways in which we can trip up. I have made nearly all of these mistakes during my 8 years in 12-step fellowship, and I dare say that I will make many more yet. All 30 of these pitfalls, and many more besides, have one factor in common. They are all ways in which we hold on to identity as the personal ego self. We make a decision in step 3 to hand over our will and our lives, but somehow we never actually go through with it. This is why recovery is progressive rather than definitive. We need to keep using the tools in order to keep making progress. Given that effective recovery hinges on the extent to which we remain over-identified as a personal self, it can be seen that perhaps the most incisive and helpful tool in the box is the tool of self-inquiry. Whichever hurdle we may be facing at any given time, we can always ask ourselves who it is that thinks that there's a problem. The answer is always the same. It is the personal ego self. This simple tool disempowers the personal identity every single time that it's used. By asking the question and observing the personal ego mind, we automatically drop back in consciousness to the position of witness. If self-inquiry is practiced on a daily basis, then we become increasingly aware that there's more to life than we had previously understood. We cannot be the personal ego self because we are always present to witness it. It follows therefore that our true nature must be that of a deeper consciousness. We may struggle to believe it, but the truth is present every time that we take the trouble to look. The best way to mind the gap is to remain self-aware and practice self-inquiry. This simple tool will immediately highlight the problem, and we can then get on with using the rest of the toolkit to continue the journey home. The result will be happiness, peace, love, and unity. The kingdom of heaven is indeed within.